Hey y'all, I'm Sunny Shell, and tonight I am so excited to welcome back to the Sunny Spot our good friend Dr. Jay Bundy. And we're going to dispel some misconceptions of evolutionary biology. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the Sunny Spot on Skeptic Haven.
Jefferson laid great stress on it. It wasn't enough, he said, to enshrine some rights in a constitution or a Bill of Rights. The people had to be educated, and they had to practice their skepticism and their education. Otherwise, we don't run the government. The government runs us.
Hey everyone, it's so good to see you. And Jay, welcome back.
Yes, good to be back. Thank you so much for having me. I love being on Skeptic Haven, so especially the Sunny Spot. So glad to be
Thank
back.
you.
This was the first show I did on Skeptic Haven, so I'll always be happy to come back.
Well, I absolutely adore you. You are so much fun, and we always learn so much. And you are actually my first back. I've been out for a little while. I've had some major things going on with my real life work, and
Sure,
so
sure.
um, you're my welcome back.
Yes.
That's awesome. So today we're talking about some of the misconceptions of evolutionary biology. So I thought, why don't we just start? There may be some people who don't really know what evolutionary biology is. So kind
Sure,
of
sure.
starting there with what it actually is. And I know that you're in experimental evolutionary biology, so maybe you could
Yes.
touch a little bit on that.
Sure.
And then we'll just hit all the craziness that we sometimes hear
Yeah,
about.
so evolutionary biology, overall is just sort of a sub-discipline of biology, but specifically focused on, the theory of evolution and understanding evolved systems, usually with regard to living systems. But yeah, it's a field that's matured. Certainly, like if you think back to say when Darwin was around, there was no field of evolutionary biology, even though we would consider him obviously an evolutionary biologist. So the discipline was called they were called naturalist back then. That's how Darwin identified himself. He would have identified as a naturalist. And then certainly, which is interesting too, because really early on, what we consider biology now was an extent an extension in a way of philosophy. It was like natural philosophy. So naturalists were natural philosophers. They were people whose philosophy was about understanding the natural world. And of course, now we call most of those people scientists. But of course, the there's like a broad range of who's a scientist, right? And so those fields kind of developed, and over time, biology matured in the aspect of studying living systems, and then eventually, over time, evolution became more and more central to evolutionary thinking. So it's actually an interesting question, because I'd actually say it's in a weird place right now, and by that I mean evolution evolutionary biologists are still considered a subfield of biologists, if that makes any sense,
Mhm.
and kind of a niche group in the sense, like if you go to a biology conference, right? The evolution people, we're like a thing, right? If we're like evolution people, and then there's like the larger biologist community, they don't consider themselves evolutionary biologists, and in some ways, um, they may even say that they don't think about evolution a lot, right? Um, at the same time, evolution is considered the foundation and the core of all modern biology. And so I think that has put people sort of in a weird place, like, because y'all are a niche, but you're the foundation of everything, but not everybody talks about you like you're the foundation of everything. It still feels like it's like a new discipline, but it still feels like it's harking way back to Darwin, and so it actually is a meaningful question to say, what is evolutionary biology, and sort of how do you draw a circle around who the evolutionary biologists are, so
Mhm.
to speak. And with that in mind, it kind of leads right into experimental evolutionary biology, just sort of a new sub-discipline of evolutionary biology. When most people think about evolution, a lot of times they think about fossils or phylogenetic trees. They might think a lot about genetics and things like that. And most of those are tools that have help us understand the evolutionary tree of life. So how organisms are related to each other and how they became distinct and things like that. But for the most part, they work that those are the foundational methods of evolutionary biology. And in a large part, they help us think about evolution that happened in the past. But when you think about the epitome of science, and I don't mean to say that in a conceited fashion, but just how you think of what it means to be a scientist, a lot of times the sort of pinnacle, the high mark of science is the controlled experiment. And when you're, digging up fossils out of the side of a mountain, you're not able to do a controlled experiment. And so for most of the history of evolutionary biology and evolutionary thinking, evolution was historical science in some regard, and it largely relied on comparative methods, and that's what we consider those. You're comparing the genomes, you're comparing the bone structure, you're comparing the environments, you're inferring what happened. But now people have realized that you can actually have evolution happen in a lab. Because for evolution to happen, you need inheritance, mutation, you need variation, and you need selection. And so you set up basically what we call natural selection in an artificial environment. And largely this is done with microbes. And the idea is that evolution is something that happens over generations. And so you need a system that evolves rapidly. That way it can go through many generations over a relatively short period of time. And so most evolution experiments are done with asexual microbes, bacteria, yeast, fungi, sort of other organisms that reproduce fast, primarily bacteria. Viruses are also used. And they go all the way up. There's evolution experiments with plants. There's evolution experiments with mice. They just tend to take longer and go through fewer generations, right? I do most of my experiments with computers because it turns out we can create digital organisms that also evolve. And then we can be even faster than the people who work with microbes. And also, we don't have to worry so much about contamination. So that's always a big plus.
I wonder with the you kind of see when you're doing experiments with actual, microbes and so forth, you can see what they're actually doing in real time. Does the computer still allow you to do that sort of thing, or is it more just the randomized reactions that you have put in?
I mean, I like to think anything they can do, we can do better. But there are certain things that there are trade-offs certainly, and things that you can't do with digital organisms, but in many ways they're even better. And so what I mean by that is, say for instance, the long-term evolution experiments with Lenski, that's like the 30-year E. coli experiment that's gone on for 70,000 generations over like 35 years or something. They freeze the bacteria every 500 generations because it takes work and it takes storage and you have to freeze them. If you're working with digital organisms, you can freeze them every generation if you want, or you can freeze them, as frequently as you like. You can save them and reuse them. Also, there's things like trace files. So usually, like with a bacteria, you can do a lot of experiments to kind of figure out what's going on, but you're very limited in what you choose. You can dye it or stain it or see how it responds to a particular chemical or whatever. With a digital organism, we can use what's called a trace file, and we can actually see the state of the organism at every single step along its life. So we can see its genome executing in real time, but we can also correlate that to the changes in the inputs, the changes in its memory. And so it's literally like a printout of the organism's entire life. I can see everything that ever happened in the entire, and you can't do anything like that with the bacteria. And and it's just time, honestly. Organisms are sexy. When people think of biology, they think of working with plants or working with mice or working with people. But when you think of most fields in most businesses, you realize they're driven by computers. Even in the businesses where there's some physical output. So say something like racing, where ultimately you have to build this really expensive race car and put it on a racetrack. We recognize that most of the preparation of the engineering of that race car happens in the computer way before they bother putting it on the track. And even the driver is going to spend way more time in a simulator than they are on the actual road course, right? And we accept that in every business, that computers have sort of changed the way we do things for the better. And in that sense, biology is sort of just catching up. But
Oh, okay.
yeah, it's still a really important change.
Well, that makes sense now. So I do have a quick question
Sure.
from Kat. I'm going to put that up. Do you know much about fungal slime?
I would say not much. Um, no, probably not much. I know that's a thing. But yeah, that's sort of interesting. Is we work with digital organisms. Work with you don't work with biological organisms. So, but you're around it a lot, right? Because the people in your department, the people you go to seminars, and a lot of times you have to teach these things.
Okay. And Wes has one back to the computer things we were just
Sure.
talking about. How does it respond to an environment, though? And is that something you can change or add to the program to predict things better? Or is this a problem? That's a great question, Wes.
That is a great question. So for the most part, if you think about it, and a lot of times a changing environment introduces a lot of problems, because you don't know how much what's happening in the system is going on, say, internally to the organism, sort of like genetically induced changes, or how much is a response to the changing environment, especially if you can't control the way the environment changes. So a lot of the innovation of experimental evolution is keeping the environment the same so that we can omit environmental change as a confounding factor. And so a lot of times you construct an environment relevant to your organism of study. What do I mean by that? If you're studying, the long-term evolution experiment, bacteria, especially E. coli, their favorite food source is glucose and sugar. So the environment that they evolve in is pretty much some salt water with some sugar in it, because it's of interest to see how they evolve to, deal with that. If you're studying a plant species, you might be interested in, how they respond to particular mycorrhiza or nutrient treatments, right? And so you may construct your environment to have that particular nutrient in it or something. When you're dealing with digital organisms, a lot of my work, for instance, is about how they respond to different environments. So it's very easy to just construct different environments. And it's also easy to say, pause an experiment and change the environment. So you have a lot of control over that, but it's important to remember that you likely won't change the environment unless that particular environmental change is what you're interested in studying.
Okay, that's an
Yes.
excellent answer.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
So it's fascinating to think about doing these experiments on the computer and how all of that works. So I think there's probably a lot of people
Yeah,
that
they're
have
very
questions
powerful.
about that.
And that's something we should talk about. So one of the biggest misconceptions that even makes that work possible is that evolution is a substrate neutral process. What I mean by that is, we're serious when we say that evolution requires three ingredients: technically four, and those three ingredients are variation, inheritance, and selection. And technically the fourth ingredient is time. And that means anytime you have those attributes in a system, you have an evolving system. So in reality, even though people think of evolution happening in a biological system, happening in a system of organisms with cells that reproduce and they're going to create another organism, really, that's just one example of an evolving system. And matter of fact, I like to point out to people that had evolution not come out of biology, it could have just as easily come out of another discipline. You could have artists who realized, oh, we can start with a bunch of paintings and then kind of change them and then see how people respond to them and then change and do this iterative thing. They could have come up with that, right? Engineers or computer scientists or anybody could have realized, oh, there's like this iterative process of you have a population of solutions, you make some changes to them, then you keep some of that, you keep what works and discard what doesn't, right? Matter of fact, to be honest, even though we would sort of consider it biology, in a real way, evolutionary theory did predate biology because it came out of farming. It came out of husbandry, right? When people, if you read The Origin of Species, what's so beautiful about Darwin's argument is not that he came up with some new thing, in a sense. What he did was he recognized that there was a parallel to something people already knew. Everybody already understood that a farmer who wants the biggest, sweetest tomatoes keeps the biggest, sweetest tomatoes, has those reproduced, discards the other one. And we see over time how you'll get bigger and sweeter tomatoes.
Yeah.
And he knew that. So he was basically saying, we already understand selection. We already understand that there's this change happening over generations. He just made the key insight that instead of the farmer doing the selecting, the environment, without any sort of human agency, does this sort of selecting on its own. And so really he was saying, what you already know to be happening from the way you observe farming is what's happening in nature. And what that also means is, like, for instance, in some classes, you can teach students about the evolution of languages, because that's also an evolving system. You can teach people like the evolution of religions, because religions also inherit from previous religions, mutate, right? And so there's all these things around us. And so this is a huge misconception. People think that evolution strictly applies to biology, when in reality, we now talk about Darwin's law. We talk about evolutionary theory as sort of a law of nature that applies to many systems. And then that leads to one of the huge benefits of doing digital evolution is we need to study evolution outside of biology. Anytime you're using a biological organism, you're using a system that all shares that single history. And so it's really good to say what happens in evolving systems more generally. And if we're going to know more generally what happens in evolving systems, we need to study something other than the biological system we use for most of our work, right? And so it's actually really helpful because we find things in digital organisms. And then we go, oh, I wonder if this also applies to a biological system. And then we go back and find that it does. And so you actually there's been a lot of novel concepts and theories tested with digital evolution that they then go back and find out actually apply to wet systems, we call them.
Okay, that this all makes so much more sense. So then that kind of gets me into you work in a university.
Yes.
And you teach. Do you teach undergrads or
Yes.
graduate level?
Usually both, but right now most of my like actual like course teaching assignments are with undergrads. And
Okay.
then you're like mentoring grad students as they're doing their research and things like that.
Okay. So as you're, all of us kind of how we're talking about, I guess you would think of us as not even undergrads,
Sure.
in our understanding of it. And so I'm sure that kind of gets us into some of the misconceptions, because I'm sure as you have students who come in their first year or even second, that they have a whole lot of misconceptions,
Yes.
and you almost have to continuously go back to the beginning in a sense. You get to a certain point, and then someone will ask a question that you then have to go back to the beginning to kind of get back to the point you were at, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
So what are some of the misconceptions that you have to answer to most often?
Sure. And I was thinking about this. There's a bunch of them, and some of them are misconceptions students have. Some of them are misconceptions that are more like in the public or the sort of general population, and then there's some overlap. Um, so one of the things that is remarkable in how much it comes up with students when you're
Mhm.
teaching, and how it's really hard to impress upon students, um, is the idea of mutations happening in response to a need. The way people think about evolution, it's like there's a population evolving in an environment, and they need something. So a common example would be like giraffes. It'll be like they needed to reach up to these higher trees, and so they evolved these mutations that allowed them to get longer necks in response to a need in the environment. And um, it's really hard to get people to understand what we mean when we say mutations are random. And in particular, that is mutations being random with respect to their occurrence, like when do they happen? And um, there's actually a famous experiment by uh, Max and Luria and Delbruck is the name of the authors. It's Luria and Delbruck. Maybe it's like 1948 or something. But they did a study that basically showed that mutations happen randomly, and they're not made more probable by a particular environment. They don't happen in response to what's going on in the particular environment. They happen randomly. Sometimes they're selected for, sometimes they're not, but they don't happen in response to a need. And that's something that even with exercises designed to teach students this, even with having them read these papers and really trying to hammer that home with them, it's just really hard. And part of it, it's just because that's the way their language about evolution has been so
Mm-hmm.
far. And subtly, that's something they think about it. It's like a belief about evolution that they don't even realize they've adapted.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Yeah. Um,
It's funny that you say that, because I, just like the giraffes that you were talking about, I had that same misconception. I would think, okay, if giraffes have such a long neck and they are evolving for their environment, why didn't other animals right around them do the same thing? I
yes.
couldn't understand why,
Yes.
you didn't have elephants with long necks, and
Yes, yes,
so
yes.
I always had that question until I went to college myself and learned more. But the way that you just described it was, I don't know, it just kind of hit me in a different way. So
Yeah.
yeah, I get what you're saying.
And even that brings up another good point, which is another misconception is the contingency. So one we talked about was sort of the occurrence. Like you can think of it as, and I try to break things down into very simple questions, and that's why I find like you need a simpler question to understand it accurately. So the first thing is the occurrence of the mutations. When do the mutations happen? And the idea is the mutations happen during reproduction or whatever, but they don't happen in response to whether the environment favors them or needs them or not, right? The other thing, when you brought up, well, why did the giraffes respond that way, but you don't have long-necked elephants and things like that? That brings up another great question, which is which mutations happen? And in order for a population to adapt to an environment in a particular way, it needs those mutations to happen. And since the environment doesn't determine the mutations, it also doesn't determine which mutations happen. And so that's another thing people don't realize, is that evolution can only work with what it's given. And if you don't have, it might be great if we flew. Right. It might be great. It just might be objectively better if we could fly. Right. But you would actually need the mutations to develop proto wings. Right. And then somebody would have to decide that they think proto wings are not so bad looking and sleep with that person. And then it'd have to spread through the population and all this other stuff. So it's not just, oh, there's a solution out there. Any population can evolve that solution. It's very much restricted to sort of the building blocks and what building materials you have, and that's going to be determined by those mutations, and you can't determine what mutations you're going to have. So I would say that's another huge misconception. There's also an interesting misconception about giraffes, and that has to do with people focusing their explanations too much on adaptations. Especially what we would consider like natural selection. So things like competition for resources or competition for foods. And what they overlook with those things is sexual selection. And so in actuality, we think the reason now that giraffes have long necks has nothing to do with them reaching for higher and higher foods. It's actually male to male competition. If you ever watch giraffes fight for mates, you will notice that the males use their heads basically like maces or like whips, right? And they're constantly whipping they're using their necks as a whip to whip their heads and attack each other with them. And so we believe that pressure, particularly on the males competing for females, is actually what led to them having longer and longer necks, and being able to eat foods, being able to establish this new food niche of higher and higher trees was just sort of a side benefit of the sexual selection pressure. But that's huge, right? Because it's like we think about the organism, and when we even go to answer the questions of how did it get to be that way, we immediately reach for it needed the food and it needed to reach for higher trees and and we totally overlook nothing matters if you don't mate. you gotta get mates, and we gotta start to think about what gets through sexual selection, what gets through that mating filter, and oftentimes that plays a way more determining factor than like food resources or avoiding predators and prey and all of those type of things.
Yeah, that's such a great thing. You just said but I was thinking about how the giraffes fight like that. It's a very odd thing to watch. I think it's odd.
Yeah, and it's kind of scary too, right? Like, it's no joke. You don't think of them because you see them so sweet in the zoo, and then you see them fighting. And you're like, oh no, giraffes could be vicious.
Yeah, it really can.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the mutations of the mutations and the different ways that they are selected for, not just environmentally, I guess you would say, from sexual reproduction and that sort of thing. What about those species that end up losing certain qualities through evolution? Like I'm thinking about the fish that end up in the environment where they're in a cave or something like that.
Yes,
you know,
and
talking about where they're like they lose their eyes.
Lose their eyesight.
So that doesn't seem like that's a sexual selection process. It seems like they don't need that anymore, so it just kind of goes away.
Yeah.
How do you how do
Yeah.
you
Yeah, I mean, all of these things are happening at once, right? There's natural selection and sexual selection. Everything's kind of happening. That's another thing that's difficult is for people to understand is that it's not as though the environment sees genes. It
right?
sees whole organisms and populations, right? And so there's a lot of things going on at once. But yeah, you do see things like just disuse. It's very costly to develop a visual system and to maintain that. And so if you're in a cave environment where it's dark and there's nothing to see, becomes to your advantage to invest your limited resources elsewhere because even though we don't like to think about it, but calories and things like that are a pretty limiting resource. And you
Mhm.
know, does what you eat go towards your digestion? Does it go towards developing your brain? Does it go towards feeding your muscles? This is often gonna involve trade-offs, and so um, organisms are going to become more fit um, if they're not investing in costly features that they don't use. And that's another thing where people have to understand. There's another misconception, right? Is the way people talk about survival of the fittest.
Oh
Um,
gosh, yes.
and the
I'm glad you
idea,
brought that one up.
yeah, and the
Whew.
idea that always selects for the biggest, the strongest, the fastest organism. In reality, it's about fit in terms of how well it fits together. You can think of fit in terms of compatibility, not necessarily fitness. And so it is in those cases thought to be a better fit to the environment to not maintain the eyesight than it is to maintain it.
Mhm.
Whereas if it were really just sort of a general fitness, you would imagine, well, why doesn't everything just develop better eyesight all the time? And then, just, everything gets evil because that's not a good
Mhm.
fit to an environment where there's no information about light. It turns out with no information about light, having eyes is a waste of time.
That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's funny. I keep saying it's funny that you say that, but it is. And there's two things that popped into my head. The first one being that sometimes the selection is not that you are consuming calories or that you are selecting for a specific mate. It's that you are the food, and what things keep you hidden better are the things that end up having a chance to reproduce. Like you have a bug that has typically white shell, and then the next generation has a mutation that has a dark shell, and the dark shell actually allows them to live longer. They're not picked on by the
Yes.
birds or
Yes.
whatever.
Yes.
And so
Absolutely.
that one ends up being totally by happenstance. But simply because they last longer, they're
Yes.
able to live a little bit longer, that's the gene that ends up, uh,
Yes.
you know,
And to be
permeating
honest,
the.
that I think is one of the real struggles for creationists, because that is what gives the illusion of design.
Mhm.
That's what makes it look like somebody must have crafted these organisms specifically for this purpose or to belong here, and they don't realize how much. Nope, it's random mutations, and then some. And I like the way you put it. Just so happened to. Um, and that's a real struggle. And I'll try to articulate it. So there's something we call just so stories. Um, and they're actually considered bad. Believe it or not, the giraffe is a perfect example of why. Um, when you're just looking at something retrospectively, you can create a narrative, right? And so the narrative people created was giraffes got longer and longer necks just so they could reach higher and higher trees, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's bad, right? Because again, we literally just assumed that they had to do so, and then we applied a whole motivation and pathway and everything, and that's a lot of the problem you bring with creationist thinking, right? Is you've sort of built a worldview on, all these things are explained by God did them just so this could be the case and things could be this way. And there's a subtle trick when you want to understand evolution accurately. It goes from just so to just so happened to.
Right.
Right. And that's the beauty of the shift that you brought up with the shells. There's a mutation. The mutation makes the next generation shell a little bit darker. Maybe that matches the substrate of the sand or whatever. And so it just so happens to make it better, right? and literally, if you can get the difference of it happened just so it could do this thing, because that's like it's like a difference in ontology. Like you're inferring that it did so to reach a goal. We call it teleology. It's teleological thinking, right? You're thinking there's some out there goal, and the system was striving to reach that goal, rather than just so happen to, which is you're thinking accurately about the mechanisms and you're understanding how the mechanism led to the change, right? And so it's literally that shift from just so to just so happen to, that is a shift from a misconception about evolution to thinking about it more accurately. And that's literally the language I try to keep people into too.
It's hard to keep that in mind. Even as you say, well, they just so happen to have had a darker, this mutation just happened to have happened.
Yeah.
And that one happened to make it easier for them to live longer. It's still easy for the brain to say, no, it actually happened because just so that it would be darker.
And that's where the first misconception comes into, because that's why people think it needed that mutation, right? That's where they go, it needed that mutation because it needed to get darker because it needed to survive longer, right? And it's so hard to get that out of students' head. That's not why the mutation happened.
Because it was surviving fine before. It just happened.
Yes.
To just let them live a little bit longer, and in one single bug, and that one happened. It just happens to happen. It's not.
Yes.
It's not. There's nothing directing. There's no force or anything directing these genes to do what they do. It's a reaction to spontaneous mutation. That's really. And it's so hard to keep that in your mind.
Yeah, another good misconception to talk about, and I feel like this is great because these are all things that are helpful for students, but they're also helpful for the general audience, is to really think about reproduction. Even when we say survival of the fittest, we're misrepresenting fitness, but we're also putting too much emphasis on survival. Something more accurate would be something more like reproduction of the most compatible. Because you can survive a gazillion years. If you don't pass your genes on, you don't make it to the next generation. Mm-hmm. So survival isn't really the filter. Reproduction is the filter. Yeah.
Yes, you just something went off in my brain. Okay, you think about how humans were so much shorter for so long. That was a totally fine thing. We know that humans have gotten taller. Over many, many, many generations, and it has nothing to do with taller means you survive better in our environment. It just so happens that people who were born a little bit taller were more attractive, maybe, or they felt they were, would the conception was that they were stronger,
Yes, there's
or whatever
definitely,
else
yeah.
allowed them to be the ones who would reproduce the most. It's reproduction. When you said that, that's just what popped in my head. Sorry, I didn't
Yes. Yeah, no,
derail
no,
you. It just
absolutely.
like a
Absolutely.
bomb went off in my brain.
And that also explains a lot of our traits, you know, a lot of our secondary sexual characteristics. So men's low voices and facial hair and you know, secondary fat dispositions, and they grow breasts and buttocks and things like that. Yes, of course, you did need mammary glands to provide milk and food to children, but that doesn't explain the swelling of the tissue, right? Sexual selection and that being attractive to mates is what helps explain that. And that also gets to like a similar concept too, which is we don't keep the best of everything because things have to get through that filter of reproduction, and things also have to get to substantial frequency. So, you know, let's just say there was a single mutation that for some reason just had so many downstream effects, it literally made a person a uber genius. You get this one mutation and your IQ is like 450. Like you outdo a supercomputer like that. If nobody mates with that person, they die childless and that mutation doesn't get passed on. And people don't realize this is happening all the time in nature. There's beneficial mutations that would be the best phenotype ever. They would really give the organism some kind of, oh my goodness, new advantage. But if it doesn't reproduce, whether that's asexual or sexual, then it doesn't get passed on. And then similarly, even if it does reproduce but doesn't get to a sufficient frequency fast enough, it can often be eliminated by what we call genetic drift. And that's again, like there's sort of stochasticity, there's like random sampling effects in terms of who reproduces and who doesn't. So again, you could have a great genotype, you could be brilliant, but you get struck by lightning and so you don't reproduce. It's not actually that the environment filtered you out. It's not that you didn't have a better, worse filter. It's just that there's something random that happened, and because of that stochasticity, you didn't make it. And so there's that's another element of randomness. People struggle to deal with the randomness of mutations to begin with, but then they also struggle to recognize that there's a lot of randomness in terms of what makes it and what doesn't.
Right, right. So there's a question really quickly because I have another thing that I want to get
Group selection, does it exist? Individual kinship, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think of so this is a controversial topic. We teach it in our class. There's definitely controversy about it. You know, you realize I struggle with it, right? Because it's tough. I think, yeah, I definitely I think in terms of selection at different levels, I think it's very helpful. How much of it is an emergent property of the group versus some sort of more individual selection just playing out at a higher level, I think is a lot of times what the debate is really about. What people are really saying is they're not really saying we don't think that the environment can act on groups. What they're trying to say is it really acting on the group, or is it more acting on the individuals in a way that we consider traditional sort of evolutionary thinking, but it's being aggregated in this larger thing? Me personally, I tend to think it's actually helpful to think of group selection because those are meaningfully different units. And I also think that it's very different depending on the system. So it's a much different thing to argue that like group selection is what's happening in, say, like bacteria forming a film, although a lot of people will say that's what's happening, versus human tribes. And a lot of times there's disagreement about that. So really what they're saying, you might have somebody who's a proponent of group selection versus an opponent of group selection, but really they're thinking about it in different systems to the extent that in a way they're not even talking about the same thing, right? Because one is talking about like a chemically mediated response that's genetically encoded. And now is it appropriate to call it a group selection versus another person's talking about actual group dynamics where there's a group identity built and like the leadership of a group determining what the group decides. And you're actually literally talking about something very different, although there's ostensibly a disagreement about group selection. But I definitely would say it's one of those things to read about because I feel like it's an important enough thing that it's like a whole real discussion between biologists, evolutionary theorists, and philosophers of science. And it's something I feel like is not necessarily my area of expertise. But yeah, great question. And I would say still an ongoing debate, definitely worth pursuing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we have about 14 more minutes.
Sure.
I know it seems like we just got started.
Yeah.
So is there like the biggest or most annoying or the misconception that just irritates you the most or anything like that?
Sure. There's a lot.
What is the biggest one?
So for some of I want to give something to the people that do watch a lot of creationist versus evolution debates, and it's just to throw it out there, the whole I've never seen a non-dog come from a dog or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know that's one. I just want to touch on it because I know that's one that gets people. Obviously, that's not evolutionary theory. And in a sense, it's not even an honest reflection of the theory because we understand the law of monophyly, meaning we understand we're primates, right? And we'll be primates because we're descended from primates, and our descendants will always be primates, and that's always going to be the case. Shout out to Aaron Ra if you want a good explanation as to why we're monkeys, but that's where that argument comes from. And at the same time, we absolutely have well-documented evidence of how new forms emerge from previous forms. So, for instance, we know that birds are dinosaurs, and that's just the way it is. Not all dinosaurs are birds, and it's just very simple. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but obviously it's annoying when you hear that, and it's just flat out wrong. One, I think that's a little bit more, I don't know, maybe subtle. Or one that annoys me personally that even people get wrong is that evolution is not still happening, or that people are somehow not subject to evolution anymore. And to be honest, this leads to academic fights. Like, people don't realize this, but anthropology departments all across the world are like splitting into like two departments, and they're doing that largely because there's a distinction between what we call biological anthropologists, sometimes they're called physical anthropologists, versus social or cultural anthropologists. So on the physical side of things, those are like your bones people. They study comparative anatomy. They study how humans are related to other primates. And they're very much like biologically driven people. The other people, they're like the stones people, right? They're the ones discovering the stones and how we made them into weapons and pottery shards. And they very much study cultural and social evolution. And so they tend to section off culture as like a uniquely human endeavor. Like they don't want to hear us talk about culture in birds, for instance. Whatever
But there
birds are,
is.
they don't like
There
that.
is.
They know because right, they're cultural
Oh,
anthropologists, and a big part of their thing is culture is this thing that and but as a biological anthropologist, that bothers you. How could we get something that doesn't have its precursor in other animal forms? That would be arguing for a break in evolution. Like somehow human just magically get imbued with culture, but the stuff we see in other animals where they're learning, where they're sharing, where they're teaching, where they're doing all these things, that's not so it's weird. And a lot of times like they don't like thinking about anything evolutionary. So for instance, we would talk sometimes a lot about how like there's evolutionarily related like assessments we make of each other when we're mating and dating, right? And so there's a reason we're attracted to certain features, right? There's a reason we look for certain things in mates. And it depends on the context. We look for different things for short-term mating and long-term mating. And we're evaluating this. Bringing this up about something like a prom, oh no, the cultural anthropologists in the department, they were not having it. They were not. You think that what's going on at a prom has something to do with human reproduction? You think that that's what that's about? Like they just and their thing.
actually, I do. Have you ever been to a prom?
Thank you. What's wrong with y'all? But their thing is that human culture is so unique and so isolated from nature and all this stuff that we're in this like different thing, and it's really weird. And the other people, we see it as like, nope, sorry, we're just organisms, like we're still evolving, we're still subject to evolution. Thank COVID-19. Probably shortened our lifespans. But that's a big thing. So that's the one that happens in the field, but it also happens outside. You hear people say things like people aren't evolving anymore, or we're not as much subject to natural selection. And we would not agree. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
That's a huge misconception. So evolution is definitely still happening. It's definitely still happening to people, and will continue indefinitely.
Absolutely. I think we all need to learn that we're not all siloed. The truth is not found in a silo. It's found when we broke those silos and we look at things from a broader perspective. And so that kind of
I want to touch on
you can have your siloed interest, but you have to understand that the other silo has some really good information that might help you in yours.
Yeah, there's a couple other things that we should definitely touch on real quick. So one is the idea that evolution is just a theory. There's actually a great article on this by Stephen Jay Gould. It's called Evolution as Theory and Fact. And so it's really understand, one, the distinction of what a scientific theory is, and that it's not just an idea or hypothesis. It's not just a theory sort of thing. It's a scientific theory, and that means it's something that is based in observations, based in testing, it's based in evidence, and that there isn't necessarily this higher standard. Even sometimes you'll hear people talk about it, well, there's the theory of evolution, but the law of gravity, again, we could just as easily talk about the theory of gravity, and we could just as easily talk about Darwin's law, right? And so they're misguiding that. But also people don't understand it's a fact. And this is another thing that, and this is a thing that gets really easy for people to do, which is a sort of, I accept the theory. I accept that this is what scientists say explains the observations, but they don't really truly accept that it's a fact, meaning that this is indeed what happened. And so that's a huge misconception, that you can isolate it as a theory and just keep it over there in theory land and not really understand that it's an accurate description of what happened historically. And another thing that's really important is you cannot say you love science and then say you don't accept evolution.
Absolutely.
Because like I said, it is the foundation of biology. And what does it mean to say you love science, but you don't love the core of biology? It is also probably because of all of the social meaning and all of the emphasis and controversy around it and emotion people put in the topic. It's also, in my opinion, many opinions, the most well evidenced theory in the history of science. And I would say because it had to be, it wouldn't have been accepted otherwise. And so it, in a sense, even if you don't like the conclusions of evolution, you have to recognize it as an essential victory of science. It's truly the core of what we would consider a scientific revolution. It literally took this notion of how did we get to be here, one of the biggest, most daring and ambitious questions we could have. Somebody came up with it, and it wasn't just Darwin. It was a whole history of the field that led to the maturation of the theory. But nevertheless, an incredible theory that was incredibly challenging. And then we went about building up all this evidence to actually support it. So it is one of the great history of science, and it is nothing less than a derision of the entire scientific enterprise to not accept it.
I agree. That was a beautiful way to close the show. I love it. You had me thinking about so many others as well. So
Part
the
two.
Next time you're on, that's right. Next time you're on, we have to continue on with this. If you guys all enjoyed this as much as I did, please make sure to like, subscribe, share, do all of those cool things. Hit the bell so you're notified when there's new content.
Yeah, come to
All of
Pocket
that
Locker
helps us.
86.
Absolutely. Oh yes, tell them what's coming up with you. Is there
I got a
anything coming
YouTube
up with you?
channel. I try to do several podcasts a week, and then I host a show called Hot Program on Sundays. And I will just say, like Skeptic Haven, it's really about the community. I have a great community of friends and supporters, and that's what'll hook you. That's what'll keep you. So come join the gang.
Absolutely. Make sure to keep in mind that we are looking for volunteers. We need production. We need bookers. We need call-in screeners. If you're interested, please contact wesdsturtevant@gmail.com, and we will put you to work because we are growing and we need help to grow. We're also in the process of becoming a 501c3. So if you really want to help us, consider joining our Patreon. And we would love to show you our patrons and give them a great big thank you. Thank you to Helen Green, Logan Fisher, Amanda McLeod, Eric Ozols, Rion, Denise Murphy, Dan D, Michael Wiseman, Cindy Plaza, myself, Aaron Coalson, and Phil Calderone. Thank you all. You help us keep the lights on around here. Don't forget to check out our other shows on Skeptic Haven. On Tuesdays, we have Secular Soapbox. Of course, Thursdays are right here with Sunny Spot. On Saturdays, we have two shows, The Global Atheist and Women Atheists Unload. And then on Sundays, we have our call-in show, Let's Talk. There's something for everyone, so check out all of our great shows. In the meantime, remember to always think critically. Check y'all out next week.
Our being knows this is where we came from. We long to return. And we can. Because the cosmos is also within us. We're made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself.
If we are not able to ask skeptical questions, to interrogate those who tell us that something is true, to be skeptical of those in authority, then we're up for grabs for the next charlatan, political, or